We have in the first reading a passage of the second Isaiah, which therefore is posterior to that which has been handled before the exile in the earlier part of the same prophet. We're handling here the time after the rebuilding of the temple around 516 BC. So there has been a return from exile, there has been great hope, but the nation itself was not really being restored as the Lord really wanted. It was to be His people, and they had not entirely learned their lesson. So these prophets are speaking out. After the first flush of excitement, the life, as it were, went out of religious observance, and worship became somewhat formal, and it can happen to us if we're not careful. The prophet draws attention to the improper motive in the people's fasting, so that has already been handled. God's chosen fast. It's actually a title of a book which is quite good. It's by a Protestant author, I believe, but it goes into what actually the Lord wants with regard to fasting, and it's not something that should be easily discarded, this discipline. Indeed, it's come back, as we know, through Medjugorje. But this part that we're handling in this reading today sets out what they will do if the fasting in question is actually sincere. The result will be that their light will shine through the darkness, and their own wounds will be healed. It's a very beautiful reading. Now we know that Isaiah, the whole book, is full of beautiful poetry. It works on several levels. And the poetry is not entirely lost in translation, because Hebrew poetry is based on images and concrete terms. So, this willingness on a practical level to spread goodness and kindness, warmth and healing, reflects what the Son of Justice does, risen with healing in His wings or in His rays. We have to have rays of healing. Wherever we are, we must be somehow an extension, a ray of the Divine Son. If we are in Eucharistic adoration, we're looking at the rays of glory coming from the Lord. Well, He asks us from that monstrance to extend that unto others physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and on the level of the heart to heart. In concrete terms, here we have, share your bread with the hungry, and shelter the homeless poor. Clothe the man you see to be naked, and turn not from your own kin. Then you will, talk about the light then, which will shine. So that is our challenge. And the Lord Himself is involved, and the glory of the Lord behind you, because this impacts upon Him. If we are doing that, then we are in relationship with Him, because we're doing His will. Cry and the Lord will answer. Call and He will say, I am here. And then the things to avoid, any kind of harshness. If you do away with the yoke, the clenched fist, the wicked word, that applies to us, unpleasant words should never be heard from the lips that receive the Lord of hosts in Holy Communion. That tongue must be under His Lordship and be in continuity of movement with the moment of encounter at the Eucharist. So, you give your bread to the hungry, leave to the oppressed, your light will rise in the darkness, and your shadows become like noon. So, as always, the psalm echoes this. It's again one of the Alleluia psalms, and so we can sing Alleluia as the response. And it speaks of the just man who is a light in the darkness for the upright. Well, actually, that's how it comes through in the use of the psalm for the feast of a saint. But actually, the original meaning would seem to be that the Lord is the light for the upright here, because you see, there's a problem here. It's actually be used also in monastic grace, part of this psalm. Dispersit de pauperis. It's something which actually the Lord dispersed and gave to the poor. Dispersit de pauperis and so on. Justitia eus manet, his justice lasts forever and ever. It's actually referring that, it would seem, to the Lord himself, but by extension it refers to the just man, who is therefore the expression of the Lord for his people. Then it goes on, the good man takes pity and lends. He conducts his affairs with honour. But then the consequences of all this, we leave a memory, don't we? The just man will never waver, he will be remembered forever. And this curious one, he has no fear of evil news. That's something which actually, if we master that bit, it's not a bad thing, because we do take away much peace and joy because we're afraid of bad news. Well, things kind of happen. I remember hearing this one time. It was a homily that the prior of the seminary where I was living as a student came out with one day. He quoted the 10 commandments of a Buddhist monk of all things, but one stuck out. It was this. And he said it in a rather calm way. Thou shalt not worry, for in doing so thou shalt undergo the same disaster twice over. So, open-handed, he gives to the poor. And his own head then will be raised in glory. Of course, the notion of glory and eternal recompense was not fully clear at the time of writing. That became more and more clear as the centuries went on. It was a land of shades and uncertainty, the beyond Sheol. But we know more, don't we? And this element of being remembered and leaving a sparkle of glory is not a bad thing either, because the saints have done so. We meet them in icons and the like. They are, as it were, still slightly with us, what an American Pentecostalist might call an afterglow. Even when they're gone, they're kind of still shining forth. The Americans use the word afterglow to refer to the follow-up to a revival meeting and so on, a time when they rekindle things. But the saints do pass on unto glory, but something remains in their writing and in the memories and stories left behind. We think, for instance, of the whole cycle of stories regarding Elijah and Elisha. It's the same thing. They're living tradition which eventually end up in print. But we live on. And I remember actually way back in the Carthusian life being aware of that, because there was the pressure not to be doing that kind of thing, writing, and at least with the optic of publishing. But I was aware actually that it's a big thing never more to write, because it does mean that what could be will never be. And okay, it's a choice that one can make, but if things actually do calmly eventually settle in print, a grace once felt can relive, and that is the power of good books. The grace given to one can be shared by another, even after he's dead. And I remember when a student doing this long thesis on Adam Scott, one of our authors in the Middle Ages, it was as though one met the person in those many, many pages that he'd written. It was the actual words that he used, because he's writing in Latin. Latin hasn't changed. And one saw the oomph of his soul coming through the dead pages. It's something else. And one has the wow feeling coming across a powerful passage that comes through the centuries, still there, just for the opening of the page. It makes a noise yet again and sparks. With regard to the letter to the Corinthians, the first one here, it is, of course, in the context of these Greeks. Now, Greeks do have an input in philosophy. Athens was no mean place. These places were the Oxford and Cambridge of the time, and even actually way into Christian period we have the influence of Athens coming there. We think of, for instance, St. Basil and his friend St. Gregory of Nyssa. They were studying in Athens precisely, and therefore Paul was the man for the hour. He was formed in two cultures, and very well, as the disciple of Gamaliel. He'd been there at the feet of Gamaliel in the school of the Pharisees, but also he was of an area of culture. He was a Roman citizen, and Tarsus was a place of culture, so he knew both sides, and he was the man to do the job, carrying the best of the one into the other and respecting what he found. So he nevertheless did not insist on that side of things and did not depend on human philosophy or logic to carry his point. He was actually showing forth the power of the Holy Spirit. Now that is actually interesting, because that is the experience of Christian missionaries, even to this day actually, but especially in the first evangelization. They find that God is very much at work because they can't do much. They haven't got all that much backing when they get to a dark place for the first time. On the contrary, they might get eaten up. But this is something which we see. Miracles. So we know that's the experience of the early Christians and the martyrs. The Lord was very much at work, and therefore it did work. It took off because there was more than just the human. And in Africa, actually, that still happens. I remember one time we had in the monastery an African who was 19 at the time, and he was studying his vocation, and he was a good man, and we would spend time, because I was looking after these young people when they would come to us, and we would go for a spin on a Sunday afternoon between noon and vespers, and I remember I would ask him questions, and he would come out calmly with things which make your hair stand on end, because down there things are quite different in darkest Africa, but things are actually quite open to the beyond, because they're not so sophisticated, so God is able to get through to them. And I remember one time, I was celebrating one time in the monastery before about 500 people. In the summer months you have about 500 people there in church, so it was a moment to give witness, and I just whispered in his ear, because he was serving, do you mind if I ask you 2 questions there during the homily, just for you to repeat what you told me? I said, well, I can't speak Italian. Oh, we'll do it in French and I'll translate. So anyway, there was. It was a gospel which was ad rem. It was that of the one with the hemorrhage. The woman with the hemorrhage was actually healed. But she had to come forth and declare, you see. That was the point, because otherwise it would have been remained hidden and the Lord would not have been praised. He had felt virtue go forth from him, power. So, in that context, we don't want the Lord's workings to go unheard, do we? Now, come here. What happened the other day? Well, anyway, he told the story. So I started from French to Italian there at the microphone, all these people listening, what's going on here? Well, it was like this, well, this priest, you see, our priest, he wasn't behaving. Anyway, the Lord pulled his socks up, you see, and it happened like this. He was celebrating, and he was singing, he was getting to the end of the Eucharistic prayer, he was singing the doxology, à toi Dieu le Père Tout-Puissant, dans l'unité du Saint-Esprit, tout honneur et toute gloire. Ah! He had to stop. The host was transformed into flesh and blood in his hands at that point. And so the celebration had to stop. So I carried on pumping my man, you see, and go on, tell us more. Yes, what colour was the flesh? He said quite calmly in French, c'était de la chair nègre, it was Negro flesh. So what does that mean? Well, the Lord was identifying himself with his people. That is interesting. That is extremely interesting. And he would go on. Other things happened, because out there people don't know better than God, and when God has something to say, they listen. Here we have a barrage of philosophers and intellectuals who know better. Of course, Medjugorje, yes, we know better, don't we? We know better, yes, we know better. Close the parenthesis. So, we have to do with power, not philosophy. But having said that, the advantage of our faith is that we can philosophize. You talk to some people from a different faith and they'll have a job to philosophize. All they can do is raise their voice. Because our faith actually is logical, and we know from the teaching of John Paul II in Faith and Reason there and all that went with it, and Veritatis Splendor, that there's no opposition whatsoever between our faith and science, because all science is knowledge. That's what the word means, scientia. So knowledge is that of the Logos. He knows everything. And you think he doesn't know things? We're just discovering things. So we get big-headed, don't we? We discovered this last place with Lord knew all about from all eternity. Aren't we great? So we get so swelled-headed that we know more than God. Yes. No. So the gospel itself is well known. And therefore we don't listen to it, do we? It's all known and read. So what is the Lord saying? Well, two things. Light, yes, but also salt. Now that's an interesting one. If we're not quite so salty as we should be, we're insipid. That's what it means. There's no taste. The word sapientia, it means actually to do with taste, sapere, and also the word insipid, it's something which lost its taste. So a person who's insipid is a tasteless person. We feel a cloud coming into the room when he comes in. Him again. Now, when people see us coming, do they say, oh, him again? Or, wow, great news. No, it's up to us, because that's kind of important. We give off what we have inside us. So let's cultivate that. In the monastery, it's important. In the family, it's perhaps even more important. In any school or any work situation, this is important. We don't attract or repel for no reason whatsoever. I mean to say, it's not gratuitous. There's a reason. If we are attracting, it means that we're attractive. If we're repelling, we ask why, and we work on it. So let's ask for that grace to be ourselves, not insipid, not dark. I'll just conclude with this. Those who have drifts in the charismatic renewal will tell you that when they're praying over people, they get a notion of either light or darkness pretty quickly. Is this soul in light or darkness? And actually we can sharpen that gift if we actually pray to the Holy Spirit to give us that sense of awareness and knowledge. We can, when we're with people, when we're praying with people, we can ask the Holy Spirit to make us aware of something of the actual nature of things, so that we're not always in need of lots of words, but somehow able to pick up things. It's kind of important. That is also the taste of the divine, the gift of taste of things of the Spirit. If we're all oriented towards things of the flesh, of the material, of even activity, we lose the taste of the things of the Spirit. We have to have a delicate taste. What is God feeling and hearing? We share that when we come close to a person. We pick it up. We pick it up. We pick it up.